Hello, you're watching Tell It Like It Is, and my name is Kathy Bennick. You know, today we're doing our fourth show, believe it or not, on the very important subject of Common Core. And it's the second show that I'm doing with the two guests who are so gracious enough to be here again today. And those are the nationally recognized educational experts, Dr. Sandra Stotsky and Jamie Gass. Now, I'm not going to spend any time at all giving you information on their background because I did that during the first show with them. And I'm also not going to waste our time today reliving the major facets of the previous shows because you can get all of that in a very, very easy way all at once by simply going to the show website, which I love to promote, www.tellitlikeitisnh.com. Simply on the top toolbar, click on Issues 2, and then you will see another bar that will say Common Core. Voila, the shows are all there for you watching, and this one will be added. A major facet of the Common Core controversy, undoubtedly, is the growing concern about it from parents throughout the country. So before we start talking about a lot of the major issues of Common Core, I'd really like to take the time to share some testimony that was given by a Manchester, New Hampshire parent shortly before the school board voted at their meeting on October 16th, 2013. And as you may know, the School Board of Manchester, New Hampshire voted to stop the ongoing Common Core implementation in that city. That particular gentleman was interviewed by Rich Girard, who is a very popular radio host here, and I think you might want to take the time to listen to him. He's fascinating. And you can listen to that interview by going to www.girardatlarge.com. And for those of you who aren't sure of the spelling, it's Girard. So let me read this to you because, again, it's pretty compelling. I will redact his name and his address. And this is what he had to say. 3 of my 4 children are in Manchester schools right now, Memorial, McLaughlin, and Green Acres. I'm in year 14 of a 25-plus year span in which I will have children in school. There are many aspects of Common Core that I think are highly problematic. In my mind, they range from troubling to truly mind-boggling. I could talk to you tonight about my disappointment that following the standards will mean that our high school graduates will be 2 years behind the rest of the world in math. Or I could express my deep reservations about the abdication of local educational sovereignty. Or I could share my outrage at the inappropriate, dangerous, and possibly unconstitutional data sharing that accompanies Common Core. Or I could recite the growing list of communities and states who are hitting the brakes on Common Core and questioning its efficacy. Or I could recount testimony from developmental child psychologists who insist that the Common Core standards ask grade school children to perform tasks that require areas of their brains that won't be fully developed for several more years. Or I could repeat stories pouring in from other states about exasperated teachers and emotionally drained children who are wrestling with a badly and hastily constructed system. Or I could mention the fact that Sandra Stotsky, credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K-12 students, refused to endorse the Common Core English Language Arts standards despite being paid to do so. Or I could mention the fact that James Milgren, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Stanford University, refused to endorse the Common Core mathematics standards despite being paid to do so. Or I could object to the shift away from knowledge and mastery in favor of empty skills, which will lead to a workforce full of sophomores, which you may know in Greek is for wise fool. Or I could explain the danger in a standard that requires children to use emotional words to construct persuasive arguments instead of classical techniques of rhetoric that instead rely on logic and reason. Or I could highlight the dangers of a system that favors inquiry-based learning that train teachers to become facilitators instead of instructors. He then went on to say, in my mind, any one of these concerns is enough to pump the brakes on this effort and seriously question whether Common Core will deliver the change that our education system desperately and unquestioningly needs. But as a parent of 4, I have one concern that in my view trumps every one of them. I'm here tonight to ask you one very simple question. Why are you experimenting with my kids? Please don't tell me that this isn't experimental when we've adopted a system that hasn't even completed the development of all of its standards. Please don't tell me that this isn't experimental when my daughter's algebra teacher unexpectedly gets a shipment of shiny new books dropped in his classroom 6 weeks into the school year, causing him to throw out his entire lesson plan and finish out the year flying by the seat of his pants. Amazing. Please don't tell me this isn't experimental when we have no data to support the theory that this will lead to an improvement in education. Please don't tell me that this isn't experimental when the Board of School Committee hasn't even decided to adopt Common Core when the school's knee-deep into it. Please don't tell me that this isn't experimental when most teachers I've spoken with in the 2 open houses I've attended shrug their shoulders and admit that they don't know where this is going or what's expected of them. Please don't tell me that this isn't experimental when my middle school daughter comes home crying because she failed a math quiz because she got the correct answers using the outdated method that she was taught last year. In my view, what this board and school administration are doing to teachers and students this year is unfair and highly detrimental. I know the easiest thing to do would be to just push forward and follow the herd because everyone else is doing it. I know the hard thing to do is slow down and maybe, just maybe, admit that we moved a little too hastily. Because instead of condemning you for making a mistake, I and all reasonable parents will applaud you for making things right. And then he ended with, after that amazing speech, he ended with, this parent respectfully and passionately asks this board to stop experimenting on his kids. Thank you. I can't follow that up. So I'm going to go right to my guess. And this is a real testimony from a real parent in Manchester, New Hampshire.
No, I mean, I think the thing that's really remarkable is we've been working in about 20 some odd states over the last several years is that there's a lot of stories like that. Many of them are from moms. It's whether it's in Salt Lake City, Utah, or whether it's in Indianapolis, Indiana, or whether it's in Alabama. You find the more that parents explore this and have to interact with these standards, the more problematic they become. And I think a lot of times, because moms are the ones that are doing the homework with their children, they are seeing
Usually,
it most intimately. Grandmothers too, and certainly dads, but I think it's generally speaking, it's true that moms and grandmothers are the ones that interact most with their kids and homework, and they're seeing this all over the country. It's not just in New Hampshire, it's everywhere. And frankly, we get so many inquiries from irate parents on it, we can't even respond to all of them. But it is really widespread, and it's everywhere.
Well, you're both traveling the country, and so I would imagine you firsthand are hearing people just like that man in Manchester.
We're meeting parents everywhere. Florida, wherever I've been, South Dakota, when a father who describes himself as a doctor in South Dakota said he had to spend a half hour with his 4th grade son on one problem in the math textbook his son was using and didn't know how to help him, and he wanted to understand why was this taking place, because he was educated enough to understand, he thought, how to help his son with 4th grade math homework, and yet he couldn't figure it out. So there are puzzled parents and there are very upset parents who wonder about the reading selections their kids have been given or how much time is being spent on what seems to be a waste of time in the math class.
Now, you know, throughout the country, we've seen these state boards of education deciding to adopt Common Core without getting any informed opinions or analyses on its high school standards, particularly as they relate to college readiness, from their own faculty members at their own state universities. I mean, what is with this?
This is actually an extremely puzzling situation. Why no state board of education or commissioner of education, so far as I know from all the states I've been in, not one of these people have asked their own faculty members who teach freshmen, the students from their own high schools, what they think of the college readiness level and the high school standards. Why it didn't occur to them that they would be the best people, I still don't understand.
You know, I think one of the things that is a point of context, of course, Massachusetts and New Hampshire has done quite well too, but Massachusetts is #1 in the country in the nation's report card, NAEP. But that wasn't always true, and really back in the early 1990s, our SAT scores were about middle of the road, maybe slightly higher. But it was really this big education reform effort in the 1990s that really committed Massachusetts to
Which
higher
this
quality.
lady was a
that-
key figure.
That Sandra was the key
Leader,
the architect of the development of those standards.
Yeah.
But the real turning point was the mid-1990s. The first couple of years of education reform was really going nowhere in Massachusetts. They were pumping a lot of money into the system. The standards that they were developing included strange things like Ebonics, which is really why they got a guy named John Silber. He's the former president, late president of Boston University.
Oh, I remember him.
And Ed DeLatra, who had been the president of St. John's College, which is in Santa Fe and Annapolis. It's the great book school. And people like Abigail Thernstrom, who was a researcher and a historian with a lot of connections to Harvard
Now, if
University.
my memory my recollection is correct, you did work with Silber
That's
and
right.
BU on some of these
I worked
issues.
for
Did
some
you
of
not?
those folks when they ran the Chelsea Public Schools
Oh, yes, okay.
in a partnership just north of in a city just north of Boston.
Yes.
But what was unique about that moment in the mid-1990s is that Governor Weld and the Democratic leadership in the legislature in Massachusetts relied on the president of the fourth largest private university in the country and experts, and then they brought in people like Sandy to actually work on the standards. So what was notable about this historic standards and these historic gains is that they specifically relied on people with real deep knowledge and expertise in academic content. And then of course Sandy relied on not only on her own expertise, but people like Wilfred Schmidt, who's a professor of mathematics at Harvard University. In fact, Sandy scrapped all the previous standards that they'd been working on in mathematics because they weren't any good. And she can tell you about it, but she relied on Wilfred Schmidt and others. So she drew on the experiences of the best faculty members in academic content areas that she could in the country. And it shows. That's why
And those
Massachusetts
results are known nationally.
they're
that
nationally
it worked in
and internationally
Massachusetts.
because Massachusetts is tested as its own individual country on the TIMSS test, math and science
Well, it is
test.
kind of its own
It is.
international country. I
it
can
is-
say that
it-
as a native.
It's true. But in terms of its competitiveness, it's right up there with Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan. But it's because of the high-quality standards that Sandra Stotsky and others worked on in the mid-late 1990s. But it was really notable because they drew on expertise from higher education, both in-state and across the country. And Common Core, by contrast, really has almost systematically bypassed college presidents, the leadership in higher education in this country, which we all know is the envy of the world. And they've ignored that. And it's not surprising now that after 3 years of them trying to implement these standards that they're having a lot of problems, and the criticisms are just pouring in from all over the country because they just weren't very good from the beginning, but they didn't rely on real experts, and as Sandy did here in Massachusetts.
It's incredible. And you don't see any move now happening?
No,
for-
they've been frozen into place, unfortunately, and egos are involved, and the people who wrote, particularly the English language arts standards, are not going to back down at all. They've got very confusing directives to superintendents and to teachers in that document, and they do not want to speak up because it would mean that they didn't know what they were doing. Now, they didn't know what they were doing, so they don't want to admit that they didn't know what they were doing. Not
So
one of the three.
unfortunately, the future of what 42, 44 million kids is secondary
Right.
to
The kids
their
aren't
own
being
academic
concerned.
egos.
They weren't concerned about kids. More and more, it's clearer that it was a power game. How to get control of the public school system, all components of it centralized in Washington, D.C., and the people who were appointed to be in charge of writing the standards, who were there and heard from others, knew what the problems were, and didn't care, were all part of this effort to make sure that they had their goals in mind, which were not the goals of the kinds of parents who are now speaking up about the problems with these standards that they see in the lessons their kids are taking.
I think, sort of specifically, for your viewers, is that these folks that developed Common Core really ignored the evidence, both in reading or English language arts and mathematics. And I just tell you quickly what those are. So the lesson from Massachusetts is that if you want to become #1 in the country in reading, you read high-quality classic literature, poetry, and drama. The quality of the vocabulary found in there
we
is
had talked some about that
just
in the
way
last show,
better.
yeah.
They ignored that and, in fact, have cut it in high-standard states like Massachusetts by 60%. And then on the mathematics side, they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and the East Asian countries that really give access to Algebra 1, which is the gateway for all higher level mathematics. And traditionally, it's been for 8th grade, or for these high standard states and countries, it's 8th grade, and Common Core pushes it back a grade or two. So not only do they not rely on real experts, but they ignored the evidence and the facts that we know from the experience here, or in New England from Massachusetts, and frankly, the performance in New Hampshire is very good. I mean, New Hampshire is right next to Massachusetts in terms of the quality of its performance. All these states have, miles to go, before they sleep, but the fact is they've made great strides. And they have not only, again, ignored the evidence, but they've also haven't enlisted the kinds of people that would give them information and research that's contrary to what they wanted to accomplish.
What makes the situation even worse, by the way, is that they have basically lied to the public about what they have done. And it's repeated over and over again. These are internationally benchmarked standards. They're research-based. They're comparable to the best standards in high-achieving countries, when it's not true at all. And how can people who are not on top of the research, like most superintendents and teachers, even argue against people who keep telling them these are rigorous, rigorous, rigorous standards? I mean, the word is repeated over and over again ad nauseum, and how can someone say they're not rigorous when they don't even know what to look at? And reporters generally don't even know what to look at.
Well, particularly when you're dangling dollars over.
And that was what sweetened
exactly.
the acceptance of what were generally unsupported generalizations. They're internationally benchmarked, they're research-based, they're comparable, they're rigorous. And if we're going to give you race to the top money for adopting these standards, you will take them and you will accept what you're told, because after all, they know better. They're in Washington, D.C. Why don't they know better?
The thing that's been kind of fascinating
Reason
about
to beware about thyself.
the thing that's been kind of fascinating about it, too, is that as these criticisms, and Sandy's done an enormous amount of research for us at Pioneer Institute on these, the poor quality of these standards, including one that was just a piece of research that she and Jim Milgram, a professor of mathematics from Stanford University, who was on the validation committee, did a paper for us just in the last couple of weeks about basically how it's Common Core really stops at Algebra 2. It doesn't really have a pathway for the STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at the higher levels.
That's what I want to ask you. In fact, the door had kind of opened for that very subject. We hear so much about STEM. I mean, whether it's a business organization.
That we need more students prepared for math and science at the higher levels.
Now, what are the consequences of the fact that Common Core is lacking that pathway to STEM? What kind of
there are
results
serious
of this
economic
are we
consequences for the future, and why our major media aren't concerned about it is something I also
do you think they don't understand it?
Well, they're certainly hearing enough from parents, and now this report is going the rounds. After all, who else can tell you what is in a set of high school mathematics standards? Someone like a professor of mathematics. So
Well, yeah.
all they have to do is
Yeah.
ask any of their own professors of mathematics at their own universities. And then the question is, why didn't this set of standards, which claimed it was going to be developed in order to prepare our high school students for STEM, why didn't it do that? It didn't have to require these standards for all kids for graduation from high school, which is a separate issue. You don't have to say everyone's got to meet calculus in order to graduate from an American high school. They don't in any other country. But at least the standards could have been there, so they could have said, you can be college ready for selective colleges if you take this pathway, which was called the third pathway, that never appeared in the final document. There was kind of a little switching behind the scenes because there were some things that
Now, what do
were
you mean by the third pathway?
the first pathway was going to be how you get to college readiness when it only ends with algebra, light algebra, too.
Okay.
Now, the first pathway, or the first two pathways, would be either you can take integrated standards or those old single subject courses like Algebra 1 Geometry and something called Algebra 2. And what that something is varies over the years depending on the schools. But the third pathway was to show you how you then could get your students who were able mathematically to get to calculus, either in their senior year or in the first year of college. And the third pathway disappeared by the final document, and no one knows what happened to this, quotes, third pathway, which was to show how to get to calculus. And the implications are horrendous because you can look at a growing list of majors: finance, economics, never mind mathematics, any science area, and any engineering area.
So any
All of
science
those.
area, even including things like medicine, I assume you mean.
Oh, you've got to, if you're going to major in a science and expect to get out in 4 years, you had better be ready for some kind of calculus course in your freshman year, because there are statistics about students who start with less than calculus who never graduate to begin with, or have to take more years and are simply shunted off into other kinds of majors. And what do we depend upon as a country? What do most of us depend upon? High-level doctors, technicians,
point.
I mean, engineers. What do towns and cities need? They need their own engineers. We can't hire them all from China, Japan, and India. So
I
there
would
are,
hope we wouldn't want to hire them all.
well,
from
who would
somewhere
want to
else.
stay here if they
Yeah, really.
came back, came from one of these countries and wanted to go back? So there are horrendous consequences if we don't have our own supply, and yet none of this was ever explored by our boards of ed. None of this was ever explored by our newspapers. Our media, I can understand. Most of them, in fact, I've met only one reporter in the Boston area. He worked for the Boston Herald. He was the only one who understood how to read a set of math standards. Only one. The others don't know how to read a set of math standards. But if they
Well,
can,
their educational pathway kind of went off in a totally
well, they're in
different direction.
communications,
Yeah,
English
yeah,
journalism. I keep
exactly.
asking them,
Yeah.
but they can't read. I can't read a set of math standards. I'm an educated person. It takes someone who's in that field to be able to tell you there's something missing. You've got to have them there. So we don't know what schools are going to do if they're told you only teach to Common Core standards because that's all the test is going to cover.
Well, you know, and the thing that's important to keep in mind, I mean, Galileo said is that science is written in the language of mathematics. So if you get the math standards wrong, it then is multiplied as you're moving forward in science. And there has been some discussion about national science standards. The framework that we've seen thus far is completely mediocre. But in a way, it's secondary to this problem that they've made big mistakes in the Common Core math. In fact, they've given back things that states like Massachusetts and California and others won in these battles called the math wars in the 1990s. And Sandy was a central player in that in Massachusetts. But these
There actually were math
there
wars.
were math wars, and it was over
There were
having
wars
high quality
in every subject.
mathematics, and there was sort of the fuzzy math, the battles with the people who wanted to have the fuzzy math or the hands-on math or what have you. And Common Core gave back things that were won back in the mid to late 1990s, and so it really is problematic. But Jim Milgram from Stanford University hit the nail on the head. He was providing some testimony in front of the legislature in Texas. And he said Common Core really is a political document. And the problem with that is that...
That's a heck of a comment.
The problem is that that's how they've been able to get so many states to adopt, is that this isn't a race to the top or a race to have high standards we've had in high-performing states. It's a race to get as many states to comply as possible. And the problem is that what standards are about is academic excellence. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to set high academic standards of excellence and then try to get as many children to meet that standard as possible. And when you subordinate excellence and academic quality to politics, you get what we've had for decades now in public education in this country, which is this crisis where we've gone, right after World War II, we were among the highest performing countries in the world, and by the early 1980s, in a report called The Nation at Risk, authored by a commission appointed by Ronald Reagan, we had fallen to between 17th and 20th in the world. And it was all because the adults who were running public education decided to subordinate academic quality to politics. So in a way, it's an old story. We're back to exactly where we were 15, 20 years ago, before we had these models like Massachusetts and California and others that really elevated their standards and made the hard choices. I mean, Sandy can tell you about it. They were hard-won battles where she had to rely on the academic quality and expertise of, again, these professors of mathematics, not these people from these schools of education who want to have kids write about math and talk about how they feel about math, do everything but actually do math.
When they say write about math, and I hope I'm reasonably intelligent. Math was never my favorite. I mean, I was always off in the other direction. But I said to my husband one night, I hear them talking about writing about math. If somebody said to me, write about math, I'd have a heck of a time putting a paragraph together. What does writing about math mean?
It is sold on the basis of the idea that if you ask students to explain why they're doing certain things in math, they will then develop, quotes, a better understanding, deep conceptual understanding of what they're doing and be stronger in math.
Whatever happened to like
We
doing
don't
something
have any
because you
evidence
knew how
for
to
it.
do it?
Right.
Well, it penalizes a lot of students. It penalizes ESL students because when you have language-heavy mathematics coursework, they may understand the math if it was taught simply symbolically, but they're not able to do the writing out of the math if you're going to expect a lot of writing out. It also, in general, penalizes boys because girls tend to be more fluent in writing. This is
And
a
they're more
well-known,
verbal.
they're more verbal. And so the one area where boys have always been better over the years, girls were always better as readers and writers, boys were always better in math. Suddenly math is becoming harder for boys because they're being asked to write math instead of just to manipulate
do
symbols.
math.
Right. And so you've got all these things happening in the name of supposedly deeper conceptual understanding or making sure students can write better in content areas. It's not that you don't want students to do better in content areas, but if you're penalizing them when they're growing up with skills that are not directly related to math, after all, you're still supposed to be learning how to read and write in the English class.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you're going to spend a lot of time
One
on
would
reading
think,
and writing.
yeah.
If you turn every other subject into a reading-writing class, you're basically penalizing large groups of ESL students who are growing in this country and boys in general
Well,
of
potentially
all
anyone.
classes.
I mean, I was kind of amazed when I heard that. I mean, this is probably a stupid example, but if a child has the correct math answer, 2 and 2 equals 4, but can't explain
it in
Right.
writing.
how they
Right.
arrived at 2 plus 2 equals 4, they'll be marked wrong. I don't get it.
No, that's
I
it's,
absolutely don't get
it's
it.
an excellent example, and the reality of it is that again, it's what Yogi Berra said. It's deja vu all over again. These are battles that have been going on for decades. We thought through the kind of work that Sandy had done in Massachusetts and other states that we had found a path out of this insanity, because that's what it is. I mean, the reality of
I
it.
think it's insanity.
It's not a focus on content knowledge, and it's not a focus on the content that students, the substance of what they need to learn in order to be critical thinkers, which is what they're constantly
Yeah.
poking around or presenting
tired of
as
hearing
the
that
goal.
critical thinking.
And
Yes.
it's really
I
not
am.
critical thinking in the sense of analytical thinking. It's just thinking negatively in certain ways about
Mm-hmm.
certain topics that they encourage by the kind of so-called informational texts that are now being introduced into schools, that are flooding the schools, not because Common Core wanted necessarily, I will say that they necessarily didn't want to flood the school English language arts curriculum with material that was propaganda necessarily, but it opened up the door for the kinds of trends going on in our schools of education, which is where we have certain major problems that Common Core isn't even addressing and can't.
And the thing is that again, what you're seeing with the education trade groups, the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, Achieve Inc., these Washington, D.C. based organizations, the reality of it is that while Massachusetts and other states have moved forward and been successful, is that the places where these folks have worked over 20 years can't cite one place where they've actually improved student achievement. And so they don't have a good record. And so what they've done is they've relied on people who haven't improved student achievement, haven't improved standards, and not surprisingly, they're probably going to end up getting the same kind of results. But it's because they ignored the evidence from high standard states, they ignored the expertise of people like Sandra Stotsky and others, and they really believe that the way to do it is by having kids write about math rather than just learning their times tables. And that by learning the times tables, they'll be able to do fractions and decimals, and then they'll be able to do algebra. I mean, some of this is just really hard work of memorization, but a lot of people in and around education reform, they don't like memorization. They don't like that kind of, the reality is that, knowledge, whether it's in the humanities or mathematics, is ruthlessly cumulative. If you don't do your times tables and know how to do them with automatic recall, you're not going to be able to get to do.
Because if you don't know the basics of
that's
any
right.
subject,
And the problem is
The
that
excuse is
moving
being
forward.
set up already. You can see it every day in every kind of newspaper that's pro-Common Core. It's the implementation that is failing us. There's no problem with the standards. They're wonderful. They're rigorous, rigorous, rigorous. But we're not spending enough money on school supplies. We're not giving teachers the right support, professional development. We may not have the right teachers. We may not have the right facilities in the school. It's the implementation costs and problems. That's where the problem is. So you've got to raise your taxes,
kinda reminds me of the
spend
other
more
big
money
subject.
because you will get better results. Then we will know that Common Core
Well, it
is
reminds me of the other big subject in the news. It's not Obamacare, it's the
The gl-
computer's
it's
fault.
the glitches,
That's right,
the
that's right.
glitches
Yeah,
in the
right, the
computer
glitches,
system.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
never the fault of the legislation.
Yeah, not
it's
the program.
always the fault of not having the right money or the tools or the methods.
Well, that's only a matter of time, isn't it? That we're going to start
Well,
saying we
it-
need to throw
Right,
more money at it?
right.
Oh, it's already
Right.
starting.
It's already
It's already
Right.
starting. Teachers need more money and supplies. Teachers' unions have already asked for a moratorium because teachers aren't prepared to be held accountable, because part of the thrust of all of this is to hold teachers accountable for the students' scores. And teachers, in some cases, truthfully, haven't seen the materials that would help them to teach to these so-called standards in ELA. So you're getting a big push to hold back because the implementation isn't being funded enough.
Right.
And of course, as long as you don't see good scores coming,
Yeah.
then the argument will be, well, you've never funded it adequately.
well, yeah.
And the only time
Exactly.
that you will find someone saying, well, we're getting true scores, is when you have spent all your money and have no money left for anything else.
Yeah, I think that's pretty scary. Now, obviously, the money is kind of that carrot stick for states to implement. And presumably, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I know it's early and everybody, when you ask school administrators, they go, we don't know yet. A school system like a Manchester, by saying, okay, we're not forging on ahead with this, at least right now, it would appear they're running the risk of losing some state and federal money because they won't follow the
That
path.
is an interesting kind of stick to shake at a school system that says, we want better standards than Common Core.
And, which is what
tells-
Manchester wants.
Right,
they've
and
been
when
they've been
the
very
Department
clear.
of Education in a state where a local school system has dared to say it wants better standards than Common Core says, sorry, you can't get a waiver, or we're going to see whether you really deserve a waiver, because we may hold back money you're entitled to if you don't use these inferior standards and allow us to use the tests based on these inferior standards. It really raises a question for parents and others to start thinking about before they go to a ballot box for who their governor is.
That's a
or
good point.
That's who is in charge
That is
in
a good point.
almost every state of a board of ed, sometimes a commissioner, but that's where voters need to think about who's going to be saying, why should school systems that want something better be penalized?
Well, I think in probably every state, now you would know this more than I, but a governor appoints either the State Board of Education and or the commissioner or whatever title it's known. And certainly, New Hampshire, the governor is involved in a lot of this. I don't know. I could be wrong, but I'm a news hound, and I read a lot of newspapers and get a lot of news feeds and so on. I have not heard our governor weigh in. I have no idea what her opinion is of Common Core. Now, having said that, her husband is an educator, so possibly.
Oh, you're finding these interesting links in many states. There's a key senator in another state who is against Common Core, and it turns out his wife is related to the testing company that is going to have. Right. So you have to start looking at what links people have had with
Well, I think it's concerning.
corporate interests that have been, like the Gates Foundation or other so groups that have some kind of financial interest in the rolling out of implementation. They could be professional development provider groups. There may be lots of hidden links from the public. You have one coming next week, by the way, in New Hampshire, who's going to be talking. I believe his name
Thank
is
God there are legislators looking at this more
Mark
now.
Tucker, and he's been
Yes.
getting money from the Gates Foundation.
And have I not heard, or am I incorrect in saying that Mark Tucker is one of his things he's most known for is that he believes in the abolishment of local school boards?
So Mark Tucker is the head of the National Center for Education and the Economy. He's been around for 20 or 30 years or so, and he's always really believed in a more top-down national system of education, whether it's national standards or testing or curriculum, the way you would find in, frankly, a lot of Western European countries. But I think the thing that's important to remember here is that the tradition in this country is the states and the localities pay for 90% of the funding for K-12 education. The federal government only puts in about 10%.
Yeah.
And so people at the state...
But that's our money, too.
It's our money, too. And the thing is that, and consequently, they should have a lot more say about how this is driven. But again, people like Tucker and others have long believed that the way to solve the problems in K-12 education is to have a more nationalized system of education. And in point of fact, what he really prefers is not to have education based in and around academics, but workforce development. That is really the model that Tucker and others have preferred for a long time. And you see that coming to sort of full bloom through Common Core. A lot of the players behind Common Core, whether it's the Gates Foundation or Achieve Inc. or others, are the same kinds of people that in the early 1990s were trying to lobby the Clinton administration to push for national standards in testing and curriculum. And so while other states were out doing the hard work of trying to improve their standards and improve the academic performance of their students, these folks continue to kind of coalesce around Washington, D.C. and push for their agenda of having a more nationalized system of education that will then be linked with workforce development and departments of labor through all these data and all these other things. But again, I think the problem is that these people have horrendous records of actually improving student achievement anywhere. And why you would entrust 45 million school children's future to people with an unproven record, and many of them are frankly anti-academic. They don't like this focus on high-quality literature or high-quality mathematics. They want it to be kind of more skills-based. Anyway, why you would trust them, I don't know. I mean,
So he has been a shill for Common Core?
He's been a big advocate of I mean, he wrote a letter in the early 1990s, right after Bill Clinton was elected, called the Dear Hillary letter. It's a famous letter. If you do a Google search for Mark Tucker and Dear Hillary, you'll find it. It was read into the congressional record by a former congressman from Colorado by the name of Bob Schaefer. And essentially,
I remember him.
and he was very gutsy to do it. It took him quite some time to read it because it's a 35-page letter, but it maps out a kind of
I
nationalized
think
system.
she ever read it.
And some of the co-signatories are the same kinds of people connected with Common Core. Now, I'm not a person who believes in conspiracies, but I also don't believe in coincidences either.
I do not
And there
believe in
are a lot of
coincidences.
people who think they know what's best for other people's children.
Yeah, yeah.
This is part of this sort of totalitarian urge
Yeah.
that they think they are equipped to make the right decisions, and we don't want to leave it to those messy local school boards who don't know what's best for their own children. So you have a group of inflated egos that hover around Washington, D.C., and think they're going to be able to make the right decisions when they haven't called the right decision for over 100 years. The last, as I may have mentioned earlier, the last effective federal policy that had something to do with improving education or academic achievement in this country was done by a legislator in Vermont, and these were the Land Grant Acts that began in 1862. But that's how far back you have to go to find an effective federal policy in this country. Since 1950, we don't have one.
Whatever
Not
happened to
one.
the all politics starts local?
No, that's exactly right. Tip O'Neill was exactly right about that, and that was something that, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat. He came and visited the United States in the 1830s and said what was unique about this country, and he wrote a 2-volume book called Democracy in America, which is sort of a profile of what makes this country unique, is that, he talked about the New England Town Hall meeting, the importance of civic organizations, of citizens, particularly in the area of education, being intimately connected with the education of their children. That this is how you make citizens for a democracy,
Yeah.
not by having these sort of command and control structures from Washington, D.C. And Sandy's exactly right. Incrementally, over the last 35, 40 years, the federal government's growth in education, in K-12 education, has grown. I mean, it was a minute amount, and now it's at 10 or 11%. But whether it's Head Start or whether it's America 2000 or Gold 2000 or NCLB or any of these federal programs, they simply haven't worked. There's no evidence that any of this stuff has worked. In fact, what has happened as the growth in federal compliance has proliferated in the last several decades is that the number of people that are employed by school districts that are not teachers has grown dramatically. So it's actually squeezing money out of the classroom and out of the school and putting it really into the hands of bureaucrats. And naturally, when you see this Common Core coming down the pike, all these various trade organizations, whether it's the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the principals, the boards of ed, they've all gotten money from the Gates Foundation to advocate for these things.
And there are
because
now
they're-
more
they're
positions,
protecting
by the
their
way, that are
membership.
being asked at the state level, Common Core testing coordinator, to make sure that all local communities have the right testing equipment in place. The money isn't coming from the feds to fund these local or state level Common Core coordinators, and then you have Common Core consultants in one community, cost $200,000 to bring in the quotes Common Core consultant to advise teachers about kinds of writing assignments they should have, the texts that they should buy. Suddenly these are new costs that are being added, and they do not benefit the kids at all.
Sounds like the creation of a whole new bureaucracy.
It is. There's a great line that Sandy included in an op-ed that she did several years ago for the Boston Globe, and she described this as no vendor left behind. We had no child left behind under the previous
You know how to say
administration,
it.
and now we have no vendor left behind. And that, in point of fact, that's what's happening. And we know from the research that we've done that this is going to cost states and localities about $16 billion to implement. It's going to be the biggest cost driver is technology cost, and there's no question that the Gates Foundation, they're funded largely by Microsoft. It's a $40 billion foundation, but the conflicts of interest have conflicts of interest around this. It's astonishing when you start to peel back some of the layers of the onion, what you see in terms of various vendors and people that have a vested interest in having this thing succeed.
And if there were some notion that this was going to really benefit the kids in some way, there might be some justification for some of this. But so far as we can see, having kids sit for 10 hours every year for these common tests, as they are going to be called, and having teachers teach to them because they know that the evaluations of their performance
based
and
on
whether
what's on those tests.
and we're not holding kids and parents accountable. Also, this has been another issue that has just starting to be raised by many people. Why should teachers be the only ones held accountable for what kids do in school, especially as they get older? Where are their parents? Where are the kids themselves to be held accountable for their own learning? That isn't even a part of it. And so you find teachers' unions now beginning to back off, interestingly enough. I am now being put on panels in the next few weeks, interestingly enough, with people who represent the local educational union because they also are concerned about Common Core.
I think they should be concerned about Common Core.
They are hearing from their members, the teachers in the local classrooms, that Common Core is not going to be good for them, even if they think it may be good for the curriculum, and they really haven't had a chance to see any of that taking place yet.
I'm not hearing that, though. I mean, certainly
We
in
don't.
New Hampshire now, there's lots of questions going on
Yes.
all over the place.
How do you hear from teachers? This is another big problem.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I have not had a single person say to me, the teachers at such and such a school or whatever are kind of banding behind this. I'm not hearing that.
Well, and that's the thing is that because
just not.
so many of these, whether it's the teachers or principals or maybe there's some superintendents that are kind of boxed in by the system, the state has adopted these standards or adopted the national testing, so they've got to kind of have to go along with it.
There's an old boys network
there's-
or an old
Well,
girls
yeah,
network
yeah.
among superintendents.
Yep.
And if the commissioner says X, then everyone else falls in line to say X because who knows in 2.5 years where you might be trying to apply for your next position.
Well,
as,
then, yeah,
and-
there
and-
is truth to
superintendent.
that,
And
and,
that's-
and it's
that's-
unfortunate, but
Yeah.
it's the way of the
And that's
world,
why
yeah.
it's really gutsy what the
Yeah.
folks in Manchester have done is they've basically said, look, we're going to defy the State Department of Education and the Board of Education and the Commissioner, and we're going to try to map out our own path.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't know that generated from within the school system,
Right.
a school board. I mean, people like Anne Marie Banfield, who lives right in this town, has been tireless on this issue. Excuse me. Rich Gerard, who I mentioned, he has a daily show, a daily live radio show, and he has devoted hours to this issue.
Well,
And
people have
he-
become aware
Yeah, his
of
big
what's
audience is
happening.
the greater Manchester area, and he has a big audience. So, I mean, I think he has gotten people thinking about the issue.
But
So
the
there are
idea that a
individuals,
Department of Education should say, well, we'll have to review it and see whether we can give you a waiver because you want better standards.
Which is
You
exactly
would
what
think that
happened.
they would be rewarding
Right.
communities that want
Right.
more demanding
Right,
standards.
because I was not there, but a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure you've heard about it, there was a forum, for lack of a better description, held by the State Commissioner of Education that was originally supposed to be for the school administrators and school boards, I guess, of southern New Hampshire. And much due to the fact that where it was scheduled to happen was not going to be big enough, our school superintendent here offered the use of our high school theater, which is quite large, and they took advantage of it. In so doing, it kind of had to be open to the public, but the public wasn't allowed to ask questions. Now, I was not physically there, but I understand that the state commissioner had indicated, oh yeah, everything will be fine, waivers can happen, and so on and so forth. So voila, now Manchester does what it does after that, because she was questioned pretty fiercely by the mayor of the city of Manchester, by the way. Manchester, now the school board did vote to say, okay, we're pulling back on Common Core. And in the paper just 2 days ago, the news reported, not the commissioner, who had already kind of, promised
Right.
things.
The top person is letting a lower level
I,
person
let me, I
get
think
the
I wrote
heat.
down the title.
Some director of instruction or
It was
something like
director of
that.
something. She was the one answering to the media, and wouldn't give a yes or no answer. Said, "Well, we have to look more into it."
And
And
why
we-
it should be that level of person answering a question
Well,
from a
that's
mayor.
yeah, I was
The mayor of
kinda- yeah.
Manchester says something.
And we've
you'd
seen
think
this
you'd get a
dynamic
higher
over and
level.
over. And so a year or so ago,
No, this was the state now, not the mayor. The mayor has been pretty clear where he stands on Common Core,
Right,
and
but you
he's
would
asked
think
some
that
tough
someone
questions.
responding to the mayor
well, yeah,
at the
at
state
this
level
point, yeah.
would be a
And- or
higher
the
level
media.
than a lower level
And
staff
I
person.
did write down somewhere who the
But
person was.
but we've
with the
seen this
state.
over and over again. I mean, just a year or so ago, the commissioner of education in Utah lost his job over Common Core, where he was really misrepresenting the state legislature and the state board of ed.
Really?
All about
I
Common
didn't know
Core.
about that.
The elected, very well-known. Elected state superintendent of schools in Indiana, Tony Bennett, a big advocate of Common Core, lost his reelection even though he had $3 million in the bank and lost to a virtual unknown Democrat in a pretty red state. He then went to Florida, and he had to resign in Florida over things that he had done in Indiana. But Common Core has been a firestorm in all over Florida over the last several weeks. Sandy was just down there a week or so ago. And now New York, the commissioner of education in New York may have to resign. It was the
Yeah, a
same.
lot of news
it
is
was
coming out of
it was
New
the
York,
same
yeah.
kind of dynamic where they had this public forum, and then people actually started asking difficult questions, and the commissioner came under fire and lost his temper. And I mean, what I'm saying is that across the country, it's a similar kind of dynamic. As soon as the public gets to ask tough questions on this, the public officials are like deer in headlight. It just they don't know they don't know how to respond to it because there's so many concerns.
And they
I find
start
it
actually playing interesting games. I testified, as Jamie mentioned, in Florida last week, and then I testified in Wisconsin the day after. Following my testimony, there were about 20 to 30 educators who were also giving 3-minute pieces of testimony, all singing Hosanna to Common Core, all singing the praises of something that hasn't really been fully implemented with any test yet to
Yeah,
show
how can-
that it has
how can
any
anybody
results.
sing anything at
But
this
they're all
stage?
saying, this is so wonderful, our teachers are so behind this. And in Florida, it was obvious that they had all been given different talking points. There was a series of comprehensive talking points that came through. So you know that somehow there may be a memo coming out from someone saying, get your local educators to say how wonderful Common Core is, and then make sure someone says that the people who are critical of it don't know what they're talking about. And so you end up with people and teachers, the audience being confused because one set of officials is saying another thing,
yeah.
and they're hearing other people saying one set of facts that contradicts the first set of facts. So where are they to go, and how did it become so political when this was supposed to be about education to begin with?
I've been poking through Katz to see where I jotted this down. When I brought up the fact that the commissioner of the state and the funding and all of that, and the answer in the media a couple of days ago was we have to look more into it. It was the chief of staff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why the chief of staff would be
Yeah.
the one responding.
Well,
to
again,
that.
it's just, I mean, Sandy's exactly right. It's sort of bureaucratically passing the buck. It's, it's the opposite of what Harry Truman
Well, yeah,
counseled, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's get a mid-level or lower-level figure to kind of catch the javelin on this one. I mean, and you see that over and over again, where we've seen that in Indiana, and we've seen it in a variety of different places, where once the heat comes on, the commissioner is exhausted his talking points, doesn't have a lot of good answers for tough questions, and then sort of delegates someone else on his staff or someone else in the bureaucracy to handle the problems.
But
Well,
you would
you
think
know-
that there would be praise. Here is a school system saying we want better standards than what we have. Where is the governor to say this is a commendable move? We want to support it in some way. And then where are the legislators
Right.
who then say, how can we support this even financially? After all, it's going to cost some money to develop tests that fit these new standards, because there's no reason why we would want the tests based on the standards they don't like, that are inferior, to be used in this community? How do you reward excellence if you instead say you're going to threaten anybody who dares to say they want something better?
And the thing too is that this is 3 years after these states adopted. They adopted really in the summer of 2010. The advocates of Common Core, they actually thought they won this battle over the standards 3 years ago. They want to be moving on towards implementation or the testing. And if you think that the standards are unpopular and controversial, the testing will be
Testing's gonna
even
a whole
worse.
nother story. You know, believe it or not, we have done it again. We have. We're running down the clock right now, and I think this is fascinating, and I think a lot of people are following this now locally, and I know a lot of people watched the show with the two of you on Tell It Like It Is. Will you come back a third time?
Be glad to, sure.
Yeah?
Sure. There's always plenty to
Because
talk to about on this topic. so
I
happy-
don't think
happy
there's
to.
any question. There's a lot more to
Happy.
talk about. And here locally, I know that we need some more answers because I did do a show with the school superintendent on the topic and the assistant superintendent. And they're both very nice people and were very, they came on the show and I'm very pleased they did. But most of the questions that I asked, the answers were, we don't know yet.
So why don't our public servants, those people in our departments of education, have better answers?
Exactly.
And maybe they need to be
Well,
on at the same time.
I think that might be where we could kick off the next show. You willing to come back?
Absolutely, glad to.
Yeah,
Really
I
pleased
am
to-
so pleased you're here. And again, thank you. It's hard to believe we did run down the clock again. Everybody, if today's conversation did not finally get you interested in Common Core, I don't know. You're watching too much television or something, but this is sorry if that makes you mad, but this is a big, big, big issue, and you've got to follow it. It doesn't matter if you have kids in the school or not. You're still paying taxes locally, and your money's going to the local government, to the state government, and to the feds.
And
if
it's
for no
huge
other reason,
for our economy.
you've got to start looking at Common Core. So, please, if you want to email me on it, feel free. If I got you mad, feel free to tell me in the email. We'll show right up at the end of the show. We will, thanks to these two, be able to get them back, they said. So we're going to stay on this issue because we need to make sure we do something in New Hampshire. So anyway, thanks to my guests.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
And let's keep on telling it like it is. Bye-bye.